Europe's recent shift from US natural gas to Canadian energy supplies is sending shockwaves through the global energy market, sparking critical questions about the future of US exports and their economic impact. This transformation goes beyond energy. It's a reshaping of alliances, market forces, and geopolitical influence. The catalyst for this dramatic change lies in the war in Ukraine. As Russia's gas supply to Europe was severely disrupted by EU sanctions, Europe found itself facing an energy crisis. Initially, the US seemed like a dependable ally, stepping in with large shipments of liquefied natural gas, LNG, to help Europe endure a harsh winter. It appeared that the US energy sector had saved the day. However, this relief came at a steep cost. US gas prices were much higher than global market rates, forcing European governments and businesses to realize they were paying a premium. The cost of US LNG became unsustainable, and there were growing concerns about the unpredictability of Washington's trade policies. With each new administration came different energy policies, making Europe increasingly wary of relying on the US for long-term energy security. As a result, the US began to be seen less as a stable ally and more as a strategic player using energy exports as a political tool. This uncertainty, combined with rising LNG prices, pushed Europe to look for alternatives. Canada, with its vast natural resources, emerged as the obvious choice. The country not only possesses abundant oil and gas, but also critical minerals such as lithium and cobalt, key components in the electric vehicle, EV revolution that Europe is heavily investing in. But it wasn't just Canada's energy resources that set it apart. It was the stability and predictability of its trade relations with Europe. Unlike the US, which has experienced frequent policy changes, Canada has maintained long-standing cooperative economic ties with Europe. Furthermore, Canada's commitment to clean energy through solar, wind, and hydroelectric power aligns perfectly with Europe's green energy goals. While the US still relies heavily on fossil fuels, Canada is already transitioning to a more sustainable energy system, making it an even more attractive partner for Europe. This shift toward Canada doesn't just threaten the US's energy dominance, it represents a significant economic blow. The EU was once the largest buyer of US LNG, but with Europe now turning to Canada, the US stands to lose billions in annual revenue. The US energy sector's reliance on foreign markets is now under scrutiny, and its influence over Europe is at risk. The ramifications of this pivot extend beyond energy. Canada's ability to supply critical minerals for EV battery production strengthens its role as a key player in Europe's clean energy future. Meanwhile, the US's environmental regulations, which make it more difficult to mine these essential materials, reduce its competitiveness in this market. The geopolitical implications of this shift are far-reaching. For years, the US has used energy exports as a tool to exert influence over its allies. But if Europe can rely on a politically neutral alternative in Canada, it weakens the US's position in global negotiations, diminishing its leverage in international affairs. This shift could have cascading effects on US foreign policy, and Washington now faces a major challenge in regaining its influence. As tensions rise, the US and Canada have entered a trade war that could reshape both North American and global economies. Recently, the US imposed tariffs on Canadian imports, including energy products, and Canada retaliated with its own tariffs. However, this conflict extends beyond tariffs on consumer goods, with a strong focus on energy. Canada is already diversifying its energy exports, particularly toward Asia, especially China. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, designed to boost oil exports to China, Japan, and South Korea, signals Canada's move to reduce its dependence on the US. China, with its massive energy demand, has become a vital partner for Canada's oil, and the two countries are strengthening their economic ties. If this trend continues, Canada could further reduce its reliance on the US, which would have significant implications for the global energy market. But what if the US suddenly lost access to Canadian energy supplies? The consequences could be catastrophic. The US imports over 6 million barrels of oil per day, with nearly 67% of that coming from Canada. If Canada decided to cut off or reduce its oil exports, US gas prices would skyrocket, especially in the Midwest, where refineries are heavily dependent on Canadian oil. The loss of access to Canadian heavy crude could significantly raise fuel prices and increase production costs across industries, from transportation to food and consumer goods. This rise in prices could potentially trigger a severe recession. U.S. refineries are not designed to process other types of crude, and without Canadian oil, many could be forced to shut down, sparking a ripple effect throughout the economy. While certain players, like major oil corporations such as ExxonMobil and Chevron, might benefit by increasing shale oil production, this wouldn't happen overnight. The U.S. would face substantial challenges replacing Canadian heavy crude. Even with an increase in shale production, the process would require massive investment and face significant environmental opposition. Meanwhile, countries like OPEC, Russia, and China could seize this opportunity to manipulate global oil prices and expand their influence in the energy market. This begs the question, how will the U.S. respond to these growing tensions? The Biden administration faces a tough choice: continue the trade war with Canada or negotiate a new deal that benefits both nations. If the U.S. maintains tariffs on Canadian imports, Canada may retaliate by cutting off oil and electricity exports, further driving up energy prices and destabilizing the U.S. economy. Alternatively, the U.S. could negotiate a new energy deal to stabilize relations and protect its interests. Another option would be to ramp up domestic oil production to lessen reliance on Canada, though this comes with significant environmental and regulatory hurdles that could take years to overcome. In response to U.S. tariffs, Canada isn't standing idly by. The country has launched a boycott campaign urging its citizens to support domestic goods instead of American imports. Provinces like Quebec and Nova Scotia have already removed American-made alcohol from store shelves as a direct act of resistance against U.S. policies. This economic protest highlights Canada's determination to protect its sovereignty and oppose U.S. tariffs. The consequences of this trade war extend beyond energy and raw materials. Major U.S. manufacturers, especially automakers like General Motors and Ford, rely heavily on Canadian raw materials for production. If the trade war persists, production costs could rise, potentially driving U.S. manufacturing to the brink. Tech companies like Apple and Tesla, which depend on Canadian components, would also face higher costs, undermining their competitive edge. Even smaller manufacturers that rely on Canadian resources could be forced to shut down or lay off workers due to escalating costs. As inflation already pressures the U.S. economy, further escalation of these trade tensions could create even more challenges. The stock market is likely to suffer as investors grow concerned about the long-term effects of a trade war with Canada. The tourism industry could also take a hit, as Canadian tourists are a major revenue source for the U.S., particularly in states like Florida, California, and Texas. If Canadians reduce their travel and spending on American goods, the U.S. could lose billions of dollars in annual revenue, further contributing to economic instability. What began as a trade dispute and energy standoff is quickly evolving into a global crisis. The long-standing economic cooperation between the U.S. and Canada is at risk of devolving into a battle for control of the energy sector. The U.S. could lose access to a vital energy source, while Canada is actively diversifying its markets and securing its economic future. This conflict is not just about the two nations. It's about the future of global trade, energy markets, and international diplomacy. The outcome of this standoff will shape how both countries navigate an increasingly interconnected and volatile global economy. The world is watching, and the stakes have never been higher. In recent weeks, political tensions between Canada and the United States have cooled following a 30-day suspension of tariffs. This pause has allowed Canadian political parties to redirect their focus toward lobbying and addressing domestic issues, but the broader implications of this trade war and energy conflict remain unresolved.